welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the Curator of Public Programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. The Fowler is very pleased to present today's program as part of our World Arts Local Lives digital programs. The Fowler's Lunch and Learn series offers easily digestible explorations of charismatic objects from around the world in our permanent collection. I'm so pleased that you joined us to chew on some sustenance and feed your mind during your lunch break. Today we are joined by the Fowler's Chief Curator Matthew Robb for an exploration of one of the Fowler's most intriguing ancient Mexican objects, a small ceramic vessel in the form of an acrobat balancing a ball on his feet. Matthew will teach us how to recognize the distinct features of the Nahua-Mixteca style and how artists used it to record epic histories and ritual practices in a variety of objects. If you have any questions during this program, we encourage you to submit them via the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can upvote questions you would most like to hear answered at the end of the program. Okay, that's enough from me. Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Bianca. And thanks to everyone else who's joining our Lunch and Learn today. It's great to be able to talk to everybody, albeit remotely. I want to say that the Fowler Museum at UCLA acknowledges the Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of Tolvangar, that is to say, what's also known as the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. And for those of us at the Fowler, the land acknowledgement is both the culmination of many, many years of work and the beginning of other conversations, not just with the indigenous peoples of this land, but indigenous peoples around the world. I want to call your attention to two ongoing programs that we engage in thanks to the efforts of our Curator of Archaeology, Wendy Teeter, and our colleagues across the region, Carrying Our Ancestors Home and Mapping Indigenous LA. And so you can check out both of those programs at their respective websites. I encourage you to do so. So the object that I'm going to talk to you today about today is from the ancient Americas, more specifically ancient Mexico, an object made by indigenous artists in what we would now call probably Oaxaca or the Alta Mixteca, probably sometime in the 14th or 15th century. You can see here this human figure with the head resting on the ground, his shoulders sort of supporting an arched neck and the arms bracing the back. The legs bent to support some kind of cylinder and ball sort of balancing on the feet, and the opening vessel sort of right around the back end. Now, it's really important to try to take a vessel like this in from multiple angles. You can sort of see how much the decoration goes around every inch of the vessel surface and even on the inside of the vessel itself. And also so that you can see how carefully the decoration, particularly the gold, the white stucco painting, and that very delicate blue. So the gold is a very valuable substance for many, many ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, but not in the same way that we think of as gold, as being a valuable material. So it's important to try to understand it as valuable and symbolically significant, but not necessarily as currency, not necessarily as a precious metal in that regard. To work it would have required an extensive amount of knowledge and experience and expertise. And similarly, that blue pigment that you see in the squares on the figure's forehead and a little bit around the edges of its feet, and in some of the figures around the rim, that blue was a very specific blue recipe, a very sophisticated, complex set of ingredients that were used. We call it Maya blue. That was you can Google Maya blue and find out a lot about how it's been identified archaeologically. It was actually a conservation student at UCLA who did the work to identify it here on this vessel. But again, so there's a lot of esoteric knowledge, a lot of highly specialized knowledge about how to manipulate materials and manipulate imagery to make a vessel like this. We have a lot of acrobats, as we might call them. They have a long history in the art and archaeology of ancient Mexico. I'm showing you here two archaeologically excavated examples, one from the site of Tlatilco, not too far from modern Mexico City, and another one, a smaller cash bead, essentially a jade bead that was placed underneath a stela at the Maya site of Copan. And you can see in both of those images how the figure's body is contorted such that its feet are up around its head. And so there's been a lot of different kinds of ways of interpreting what these kinds of poses mean. It definitely seems to have some kind of reference to an alternate plane you might think of it as kind of a non-normative body pose. And so something similar is almost certainly going on with the figure that we see here. One of the challenges, of course, when we're looking at an object like this in a museum collection is that we don't actually know where it came from. It was almost certainly looted sometime in the 20th century and then came onto the art market in the US and then was donated to the Fowler in 2012. The people who owned it before it came to the Fowler probably had it for about 40 years or so in their private collection here in Los Angeles. But it's worth pointing out that this vessel is very, very similar to another vessel that's also in the Fowler's collection that came into the museum in 1983, again, as a donation. So we don't really know a whole lot about the history of these objects, and that's something that I'm eager to get back into when we can get back into our offices and our files. I have seen a slide in the collection of an LA curator who used to work at the Museum of Natural History, probably from the 1960s, that shows both of these slides or both of these vessels together on the hood of like a red pickup truck. I don't know where that slide comes from. I don't know when it was taken, but it's very suggestive that these objects might have come from the same place. And so that we'll have some opportunities to research that kind of history further. But what else can we tell about this vessel despite these kinds of irretrievable losses and damages from the looting? One of the things that we know because of the kinds of associations that we can make with other objects is that this is part of a broader cultural tradition that we characterize as Nahua-Mixteca. So what does that mean? Well, sometimes if you Google that term or you Google other terms like Mixteca Puebla, these are terms that are referring to art styles across Mesoamerica in the 12th and 14th centuries, so a couple hundred years before the Spanish invade. It's really generated out of the Mixteca Alta and parts of Puebla and Tlaxcala in central Mexico. And it's characterized by these astonishingly sort of like high-end luxury goods. So these very finely painted ceramics using really, esoteric recipes to get some of these different kinds of materials onto them. Metallurgy, gemstones, working in rock crystal and turquoise, and these painted books that we call codices. And so all of this combines into a fairly widespread set of iconographic motifs. And it's happening in mural painting and even some monumental sculpture as well. And so it's iconography that's recognizable across media, across linguistic and ethnic boundaries. And so it's a kind of a lingua franca, an international language that different groups can use to communicate with each other, even if they're not necessarily speaking the same actual language. The terms themselves both refer to kind of ethnic groups and language groups as well as these geographic regions. So Nahua is the ethnic group that we say is like, well, they are speakers of Nahuatl. And there are about 1.5 million people who speak Nahuatl today, mostly in Mexico, but also in the United States. Mixtec is a Nahua word for cloud people, that is to say the resident of the Mixteca region. And there are about 500,000 people who speak that language today. You see the sort of the ethnonym for Mixtec there, the Newt Zawi, the people of the rain. And so that matches pretty closely with what the Nahua called them, as cloud people. So Nahua-Mixteca. And so that gives you some idea of the ways in which even this art style is sort of combining these different traditions from mostly generated out of the Mixteca Alta and the Oaxaca Valley as a way of understanding the broader art style that sort of spreads all across different parts of Mesoamerica. But the red circle that you see there on the screen, the Oaxaca Valley down there at the bottom, the edge of the red circle just hitting the Valley of Mexico there on the left. That gives you a sense of where the sort of the main sites and the main areas of production were for these kinds of objects. So what are we talking about? When we're talking about Nahua-Mixteca ceramics, this is a sort of a selection and you can sort of see the different vessel types, kind of these little sort of goblets or cups, these tripod vessels. The one in the center there, that sort of big urn, that's probably for drinking pulque, a sort of lightly alcoholic beverage. You can think of it as a precursor to mezcal. And as well as these plates like you see on the right-hand side. And so you can see even here, this kind of heavy use of an orange background and a little bit of, some white highlights, these other darker colors to convey these iconographic details. And I should say that this is highly sought after right up until the Spanish invasion of the 16th century. So the Aztec Tlatoani out of Tenochtitlan in Mexico, what's now Mexico City, they want this kind of tableware. They're asking for, and in some cases ordering, Mixtec craftspeople to come to Tenochtitlan to make these kinds of high-end goods for their court. So this is highly, highly desirable for a good couple hundred years. Just to give you a sense of the sort of other kinds of objects that get made, this is a wooden tablet encrusted with turquoise mosaic that was found in a cave in Oaxaca, I think in the early 1980s, as part of an excavation of this very large and very deep cave system. This is where we get a lot of these kinds of objects that are often not preserved well in the archaeological record. We find them in cave contexts. And so you can see here, as with the ceramics before, we're getting this kind of precise delineation of bodies and forms and motifs. But here it's being articulated in tiny little bits of turquoise. So here you sort of see the detail that I've highlighted on the right, this figure sort of grabbing the hair of this other figure who's kind of twisting his body around. And so this is probably a scene of conflict. This is probably some kind of warfare, a scene of warfare. And we know that this is an important aspect of what gets represented in a lot of these objects, as a lot of the lineages that are in this region are competing for power and making their own strategic alliances. Just to show you some of the most spectacular objects that we associate with this time period in this tradition. These are some of the gold and rock crystal objects that were excavated at Monte Alban Tomb 7 in the early 1930s. So Monte Alban is the site some of you may have even been to in Oaxaca. Established by the Zapotecs very early on, but then later reoccupied and reused by the Mixtecs in this period. And so Monte Alban Tomb 7 was actually a tomb that was reoccupied, essentially, just sort of reusing that space by the Mixtecs. And so they included these incredible gold objects, rock crystal objects, as well as these carved bones. There are a number of these that come from Tomb 7, and they're all carved to the same level of detail. And so again, you can see this use of very precise outlining, some of the same kinds of motifs that you see on the ceramics, as well as in the codices. Now, this object in particular is probably a weaving batten, as are the other objects. And there's been a lot of suggestions that at a minimum, the resident of Monte Alban Tomb 7, the primary burial in Tomb 7, was at least gendered as female, if not in fact biologically female, because of the associations that we have between these kinds of weaving implements and the work that women did to weave textiles. And there's a lot of ancillary evidence to support that claim that suggests the occupant of this tomb was a very important woman. So I'm happy to provide more references on that in the Q&A. Just again to show you some more, just some spectacular things. This tortoiseshell necklace from Monte Alban Tomb 7, and these incredible bells. They're also, working in copper, not so much in silver, but just to give you an idea of the level of technology that we're looking at here. The other thing that's a real characteristic of the Nahua-Mixteca style, and this is what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about, are these painted codices. So some of you may have had a chance to see a couple of these as they've been in Los Angeles, what's called the Zush Natal in the British Library there now has been to LA a couple of times actually. So we've been fortunate to be able to see it in person, and there's really nothing quite like it because the colors really pop. No photograph, no reproduction really does them justice. the Mixtec would have called these books Nyuhu, or sacred deerskin. They're complex documents. They don't have written language in the way that you might think of as a codex from medieval Europe or something like that, but very detailed presentation of events and individuals with dates and calendrical glyphs and all that kind of stuff. Most of them, there are about 18 of these codices from this tradition that survive today. Most of them are in libraries in Europe, and they're named after the people who collected them, or the people who studied them, or the libraries where they are now. There has been an effort to change that, to give them indigenous names, and so I'm indicating those some of those proposals to you here, and so that you can find them both if you're looking for them either way. They're screenfold, so you would have been able to sort of like open up multiple pages at once, and we do have a sense that they were used in performances, so that you could essentially imagine somebody sort of retelling one of these histories, one of these legendary stories. And this one in particular, the Zushnatol, tells the story of a warrior and a ruler named Eight Deer Jaguar Claw. And so it's very, there's a lot of politicking, there's a lot of journeying that goes on in these documents that makes them really fantastic stories. As far as knowledge bearing objects go, the Nahuatl phrase that you see here on the screen for in tlili, in tlapali, the red, the black, this is a kind of Nahuatl couplet for talking about writing, for talking about painting, books, and knowledge more broadly. So you read them from the top right, you go down, you follow these red lines, you go down, and then you go over to the left, you hit a red line, you go up, and then you go over, and then you hit the end of the page, then you go down again. And so here you see Eight Deer in a wedding ceremony, exchanging a tripod, probably with cacao in it, so a chocolate drink, as he's getting married to 13 Serpent. And these kinds of marriage alliances, it's very Game of Thrones. You know, there's a lot of this kind of back and forth between different dynastic lineages and different places. And in fact, they are so specific about places that one of the reasons that some of these documents have actually survived is they were seen as evidence in court cases to determine who actually had legal authority over things. But to get back to our Acrobat vessel, I was just sort of trying to find out where we might find some in these codices to try to understand a little bit more about what it's finding. And I actually found one in the Vienna Codex, also known as the Yuta Tino Codex. And so again, you start at the upper right-hand part of the page, or no, in this case, the bottom of the page, and you work your way up, over, down, over, and look at what's right there. There's this Acrobat figure right in this kind of bracketed shape with these stepped frets. And that's a figure that's exactly in the same pose as the Fowler vessel. Now, the sequence of pages in the Vienna Codex is coming as a culture hero by the name of Nine Winds. He's a kind of Hercules, sort of demigod kind of figure. He actually lifts the waters above the earth and reveals all of the landscape. And there are all these other water signs in that part of the codex, you know, sort of spirals and sort of frothing, heavily moving water. And so there's this kind of chaos in the landscape. And so one of the things that I think is going on here is that this Acrobat is actually a way of signaling that chaos, that this is a sort of non-normative body posture, certainly in comparison to the other kinds of postures that we see in the Vienna. And that could have been a way of sort of understanding, if you were performing the story of Lord Ninewind, that you would have had an Acrobat to sort of like be the person who evoked that sense of chaos as the landscape is emerging from these waters. And so that may be part of what's going on in a vessel like the one that you see on the left, the one that's now at the Fowler. But this is the kind of thing, you know, trying to connect the dots between all of these multiple sources that we try to do when we're trying to understand a vessel like this. And it's also important to recognize that this is part of a longer cultural tradition, not just the ancient objects that I showed you at the beginning of the text, but one that persisted on into the colonial period and even after. What I'm showing you here are a couple of pictures from the Trachtenbuch of Christoph Weidetz. He was a German artist that was visiting the court of the Emperor Charles V in the late 1520s. So after the fall of Tenochtitlan in August of 1521, there were groups of indigenous nobles, either from Tenochtitlan or other states like Tlaxcala, that would go back to the imperial court to petition for land rights and redresses of grievances, those kinds of things that you would do if you had to deal with a new king. And they would bring their courtly retinues with them. And in this case, some of the nobles brought along a retinue of performers, including acrobats and ball players. And so that's very similar to what you see in the Fowler vessel. And of course, in many respects, we can say that these traditions continue even today. Some of you may know that Southern California, of course, has many immigrants from Oaxaca. And there's a traditional game called the Pelota-Mixteca that communities play in the San Fernando Valley. There's a California League of the Pelota-Mixteca and even international games between Mexican and US teams that play the Pelota-Mixteca, which has become a kind of signifier of Oaxacan cultural identity in different parts of the US and Mexico. So those are some of the stories that an object like this can tell, and be happy to tell some of the other ones in the Q&A if we've got time. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, we have some time for Q&A. If you guys have any questions and you haven't submitted them yet, now is the time. We had a bunch of questions about how people could find this program afterward and share. So I've been making sure that folks know to check our Instagram at Fowler Museum and on our website. In the meantime, as some other questions roll in, we've got someone wondering if you have any information about the red pigment that we see so often in the deer skin object.
Right. Let me go back. Yeah, so back to something like this. I don't have a whole lot of information off the top of my head, but what I can tell you is that very often when we see red pigments like this, that they're iron-based. That's the sort of the solution that I would look at first. The other thing that I can tell you is that there's a sort of an international interdisciplinary team of scholars, sort of headed up by one of our colleagues in Italy, David Dominice. And they've actually done a lot of work to do kind of analyses of these pigments. In many cases, you can do non-destructive analyses to get the elements right. And so they've done a lot of work on the individual codices that are in a lot of the libraries in Europe and in Mexico. So I can provide some references on that front as well. And
is there someone really loves this document and is wondering if there's any copies available?
This is one of the really tough ones. I actually had to make a last-minute call to one of my colleagues for this image. My colleague Byron Hammond at Ohio State University. This document is held by the Austrian National Library in Vienna, and there is an online version of it available. But it's a very low resolution set of scans. And other libraries have made more of an effort to make these documents available online. So the Zuschen et al. This document is available through the British Museum website. There are some that have been published in commercially accessible facsimiles. There's a good Dover edition of the Zuschen et al. That's pretty inexpensive. There's another codex called the Borgia Codex that similarly has a Dover edition. But the actual hard facsimiles, the actual facsimiles for these objects are not inexpensive. The Vienna Codex facsimile is about $1,200. So there's a lot to be said for pressuring libraries to make these available online, so that people can learn about them and people can share them.
Thank you. And then Peggy's wondering if there's a significance to the dots on the sculpture and in the codex.
Really good question. So I think that when I'm looking at the dots on the figure, they seem to be much more about the figure's costume. We do have some sort of polka dot costumes that show up in some of the codices, and certainly on the ball. They might be referring to things like stars. It's a little tough for me at this stage of what I've been able to research to figure that out. Some of my colleagues may have already figured it out. When we're looking at the dots that you see here that are sort of attached to these different animal shapes, and what we sort of call the trapeze and ray sign that kind of looks like a capital letter A with a capital letter O across it. Those are actually calendrical signs. And so the numbers, the dots in that case are numbers. And so in this case, it's sort of like, so this is an event that took place in the year 2 Flint. I'm looking in the second column from the right. So there's an event that happens in the year 2 Flint, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 lizard. The event just below it is an event that takes place in 3, I think that's 3 reed or 3 arrow, 2 grass. And so that's one of the ways that we can sort of tie these events into sequences of history and events, whether or not they're mythical, which is more what's happening here, that this is happening in a distant past, as opposed to the events that are happening in the life of 8 deer, where we know, because we get lots of different versions of the story of 8 deer, that this is really happening in the 12th century. That's when we can really sort of pin his life to.
Got it. Very interesting. Someone's wondering if you can talk more about where the gold is on the Acrobat and how it would have applied, and if you can offer anything more about the imagery painted on the vessel itself. They think that's very interesting that the Codex Vienna Acrobat has storm god attributes.
Did I hear stone god?
Storm
god. Storm god. Yeah.
Tlaloc?
Yeah, no, so I'll try to flip back and forth a little bit. So so this just to show you, so you see there's gold sort of around, he's got kind of like a gold belt, or sort of a loincloth that sort of wraps around. There are little bits of gold around his thighs. There's kind of a gold pectoral, a disc sort of on his chest, and then all over his face, and a little bit in his ear flares. How that would have been applied is a really good question. I'd have to go back to the conservation report that was carried out a couple of years ago to sort of see what kinds of adhesives they were using. There are other, again, sort of like from codices, we know what kinds of recipes, what kinds of binders they were using to fix the pigments onto the page. And in some cases, they're similar to the kinds of binders that are being used to fix pigments onto wet stucco in mural painting. And so if that's the case here, that would be my first hypothesis that I would look for, is like, how similar is this to the binders and the recipes that we see in the Codex tradition and the mural painting tradition. So that's a little bit about the gold. It's super, super thin. So again, we get into all these things about hammering it to this kind of incredible fragility. But to go back to our Mixteca guy, it's hard to get there quickly. Yeah, there's some storm god going on there, which again could relate to potentially some of these ideas that I'm tossing around about, sort of the storming waters that are taking on. He's got this kind of sort of hummingbird diadem. I think it's super interesting that instead of a rubber ball here, this ball is actually marked as a stone, like a boulder. And so again, the landscape is in chaos, or that's one of the ways that I think you can look at this kind of symbolism. The human figure kind of emerging there, got nothing on that. So,
okay.
Any questions? I'm happy to take them.
I think we have time for one last question. Let's see, which one do I want to choose? Someone's wondering if you know what kind of bone was used.
Bone. Oh, you mean back here from the Tomb 7 offerings? I don't, but I can get the reference and see if they talk about that.
Okay, we have the email address for the person who asked the question, so we can get back to them.
That's great.
Awesome. Well, this is the end of our 30 minutes, Matthew. Thank you so much for giving us a peek into the hidden stories and history of that magnificent object. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. There's been a lot of questions about where this program will get archived. So I've put a link in the Q&A. It'll be at fowler.ucla.edu/videos. And it'll also be shared on our Instagram at our handle at Fowler Museum. So you guys can revisit those and share them and use them as you see fit as soon as they're posted in the coming week. Thank you, everyone. I hope that you'll join us again soon. You can find details about our next program on the closing slide. Thank you, Matthew. See you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.